Welcome, everybody, to the launch of the Lancet Commission on the value of death. My name is Richard Horton, and I'm from the Lancet, and I would first like to thank Libby Salno, Richard Smith, and all the commissioners, some of whom you're going to see in the next hour or so, who have contributed so massively to this report. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Jocelyn Clark, for leading the Lancet side of this project. Now, the Commission, as you will hear, touches on issues that many of you will be familiar with: assisted dying, end-of-life care, breaking bad news, the inexorable pursuit of immortality, overtreatment, advanced directives, and the idea of a good death. You're also going to hear, just as you've heard about health systems, you're going to hear about death systems, the relationship with death that we have, but also the relationship with the planet, and some principles that the commissioners have devised for us to reflect upon. But I also hope that this commission can transcend even some of these important matters. Some years ago, I sat in the audience of a London theatre, not to watch a play or a musical, but to witness a very different kind of performance. Because the partner of a really quite remarkable woman, remarkable to all who knew her, although she was not well known as a celebrity or in the media, but her partner had invited her friends, her colleagues, and all of her associates to the theatre during the day. She recently died, and he was determined to mark not only the value of her life, but also the value of her death, because it was her death, not her life, that had provided the opportunity for those who knew her to come together to speak about what she meant to them, from the deep to the trivial, the serious to the amusing, the private to the public. And we all sat in the audience and understood, and it was something of an epiphany, actually. We all understood that had it not been for her death, we would not have gathered together that day. It was her death, not her life, that was the occasion for this unique joining together. It was an assembly of voices that would never, ever congregate together again. It was her death, not her life, that had provoked this moment. It was her death that had invited all these disparate parts of her existence to meet, to listen, to be amazed, to be awed, to be touched by her personal qualities and her professional skills. So death has value at the very least, because it reminds us that every single individual on this planet, their life counts. It matters, and it makes a difference. A single life can affect the lives of others. From the good morning that you give when you buy your newspaper every day in the supermarket, to the exchange of good wishes with your neighbor on the stairs. Death has a value because it encourages us all to pause, to stop, and to think about the interpretations and the meanings of a life, to you and to others. So I hope that we're going to provoke you to think differently about this idea of death in the next hour and a half or so. And we're going to begin with a video from Richard Smith, who was the initiator of this idea. And then after Richard, we're going to go straight to Libby, who's going to introduce the first panel. So cue Richard.
Hello, I'm Richard Smith, and I'm one of the founder members of the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death. And I'd like to talk now about the origins, the development, and the context of the Commission. So we began 4 years ago with the idea that something is badly wrong with our relationship with death and dying. We identified that there is too much treatment at the end of life, quite a lot of it futile, and that a lot of that is increasing rather than decreasing suffering. We identify that death has turned from a family, social, cultural event into predominantly a medical event. And we wouldn't argue that death is taboo, but it's hidden. Most people have become very unfamiliar with death and dying. And what's interesting, when we went around and talked to people about this unhealthy relationship, we found that almost everybody agreed, families, patients, citizens, and most health professionals. Very few people said that's a crazy idea. So then we began on our work, and interestingly, we have this slightly unusual name, the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death. And that's because the Lancet has also been planning a Lancet Commission on the value of life. And we recognise very much that death and dying and living well all go together. Death is very much part of life, which I think we've tended to forget. And it also caused us, we had a philosopher on our commission, to think a lot about, well, what is the value of death? Well, there's the obvious line, which I've used many times, that without death, every birth would be a tragedy. And in such a heavily populated planet, that may be already true. And then the fact that we die may well be the most important thing about us. That's what a lot of philosophers argue. And the fact that we all die brings us together. It's something we have in common. And then a lot of people, including Gandhi in his autobiography, have described how caring for the dying is actually a gift. It teaches you a lot that is wonderful to hear. So we assembled a group of commissioners that included social scientists, a philosopher, religious leaders, an author, journalists, and of course lots of health professionals, but not just palliative care physicians, but an oncologist, nurse, GP, and a surgeon. And our sort of central idea in assembling this commission was that death and dying belongs to everybody, not just to health professionals, and certainly not just to palliative care physicians, although there has been a tendency to begin to think that way. Several of the commissioners are from low and middle income countries, and we knew already from the Lancet Commission on Pain Relief and the Relief of Suffering that the majority of people in the world have no access to good end-of-life care. In fact, many don't have access to opioids, and I think the Lancet itself has described dying in pain without access to opioids is really a form of torture. But we also realised that actually this problem of excessive treatment at the end of life is also happening in low and middle income countries and is a common cause of families falling into poverty because they have to pay for the treatment. As we went through the commission, our thinking evolved in leaps. I just want to quickly describe 4 of those. A central idea to this commission is that there is a death system, that the way we die and the way we think about death is influenced by a great many factors: cultural, social, community, political, economic, technological, philosophical, and of course, clinical. And this is a complex system, and it means really that there are no simple fixes to achieving a healthier relationship with death, and that as you play around with systems, unintended consequences can be common. But at the same time, systems do change, and the report describes factors that make a big influence on changing systems, and we make recommendations on how the death system might be changed. I should probably make clear that there are, of course, many death systems in different cultures and different contexts. A second important idea, I think, for the Commission is that with such a wide range of people, we couldn't expect everybody to agree about everything. And we thought it was important to record how much agreement and disagreement there was. And if you look in the report, you can see a chart that shows how much people agreed with a variety of different statements. Like, do you agree with assisted dying, which we knew would divide people. And actually what's interesting is there's perhaps more agreement than we sometimes expected when we had our frantic debates. And I would recommend that every commission ought to include something like this. Thirdly, we use the idea of scenarios. think a lot of people listening will be familiar with the idea of scenario planning, imagining different plausible futures. And we describe 5 possible scenarios of how death and dying might evolve. One of which was systems being overwhelmed and unable to cope with the number of people dying. And we have seen that during the pandemic. Another was that assisted dying would become much commoner and account for many more deaths. And then fourthly, again, very central to the report is the idea of a realistic utopia, something that was proposed by John Rawls. And we try to imagine what is a future that is achievable, that is realistic, but at the same time is radical and is quite different from what we have now. And that's what we've attempted to do in this report. And Libby, when she speaks, will describe the features of our realistic utopia. And something that I think it's very important to realise, and it's clear in the report, is that actually something very close to the realistic utopia we describe already exists in Kerala and India, and we pay a lot of attention to that. I'd recommend people to read that part of the report in detail. Now, as I said at the beginning, we started 4 years ago, so 2 years before the pandemic began. And by coincidence, we had a meeting of all the commissioners online just at the moment as the number of deaths in the pandemic were beginning to rapidly increase. And we thought for a moment, my goodness, how could we possibly publish a report with the title The Value of Death when there are so many tragic deaths happening all over the place? But during that call, we reached the opposite conclusion, that actually, if we were to have already the kind of world we're advocating in relation to death and dying, then we would be in a much better position. And then we went on and realised that actually the pandemic, excessive treatment at the end of life, and these grandiose attempts to actually defeat death, which we describe in the report and is happening on quite a big scale, there are very big and real investments being made in trying to achieve immortality. That actually all of these features, the pandemic, the excessive treatment at the end of life, the attempt to achieve immortality, have in common the delusion that we are masters of nature, not part of nature. And then we went on and realised that actually this is also true in relation to climate change. One of the other hats I wear is that I'm the chair of the UK Health Alliance on climate change. And we realised there too we have the delusion that we are masters of nature. And we went on to realise that end-of-life care is actually uses a lot of carbon, leads to the emissions of lots of greenhouse gases. In the report, we calculate that about 10% of healthcare expenditure is spent on people in the last year of life. And there's a lot of excess there. And there is a very close relationship between expenditure and emissions of greenhouse gases. So a lot of greenhouse gases are being emitted by people who are receiving treatment at the end of, or rather the people doing the treatment. And we also, I know that healthcare is a major emitter of greenhouse gases, so actually causing lots of problems in the pursuit of something that we hope would be a good thing. So we need a lot to think about the relationship between climate change and excessive care at the end of life. We'll be discussing that more in various ways. So let me end by thanking everybody who's been part of this, the commissioners, the many other people who contributed, and the Lancet team who've done a great job. And I urge you to read our report and think about how you can contribute to the change that needs to happen. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So we're now going to move to hearing more about the content of the report. My name is Dr. Libby Salno, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Commission and palliative care physician. Dr. Afsan Vidalia, who is a Senior Research Associate and Fulbright Scholar at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, is now going to talk through one of the central concepts that we use in the Commission report, the importance of death systems.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salno. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are all going to die someday, and how we die is up to us, what we do together. Over the next few slides, we'll be sharing what our report proposes to revolutionize the unhealthy human relationship with mortality. I'll briefly share key messages of the Commission's report and provide some context on the importance of death systems to implement the Commission's recommendations. As with any commission, we developed key messages, 8 to be precise. The point, paint the context, present a call for action, and highlight the implications of inaction, some of which Richard just summarized. This is what our messages say. 1, dying in the 21st century is a paradox, where millions are overtreated in an attempt to briefly halt death, while many die untreated and preventable deaths. 2, death, dying, and grieving in this time of pandemic and planetary demise are in an imbalance. The experience of death is orchestrated by professionals and protocols in healthcare systems. However, these healthcare systems often forget and even undermine the importance of relationships and networks of support from families and communities. 3, we live in a delusion that we are in control and not a part of nature. 4, we can rebalance death by changing the underlying death systems. 5, or if we don't, the imbalance in debt systems will continue to disproportionately impact the disadvantaged and powerless. They suffer the worst consequence of the imbalance. 6, a new vision of death and dying is possible. It is a realistic utopia that is governed by 5 principles. 7, some communities are reclaiming death and transforming how people die and grieve. They are doing so by making it a social imperative and a community activity. We need more communities converging for change to have a sustained movement. And last, 8, the radical change of death systems is needed to rebalance death, dying, and grieving. It's a collective responsibility. At a first glance, the story of death and dying in the 21st century appears to be a successful one. There are trends that may call for triumph. Global life expectancy rose by 16 years in the past 3 decades. But that glares over the disproportionate gains within and across countries and for specific population groups. There have been stalls and reversals as well. Life expectancy of Black women in the US with specific socioeconomic characteristics has fallen in the past 2 decades. Some of the reversals are yet to be known given the ongoing and unmeasured impact of the pandemic on life expectancy, especially in LMICs. A life lived in good health is surely of importance, but healthy life expectancy has not kept pace with increases in overall life expectancy. The number of years lived without good health has increased in the past 2 decades. There has been a global shift in the causes of illness and death from communicable to non-communicable diseases. These have generated new challenges for health systems to manage chronicity and the implications of long-term care. Lastly, over 57 million people globally experienced serious health-related suffering in 2017 that can be alleviated with adequate access to palliative care and pain relief. Most in the world do not have such access and live and die in pain. The lived reality of the death experience is vast and varied, while there are also some points of commonality. For example, elders play a key role in understanding the signs and rituals of death. In certain cultures, they may even serve as pronouncers of death. They also often shepherd the process of making death a community event. In rural Malawi, Luxandeli notes, quote, "Death is confirmed by the elders. There is no exact checklist, but experience from having witnessed so many deaths has taught them that dying lose weight fast. Their strength fails. They speak little or incomprehensibly, and their breath is often shallow and labored." And Maharaja Gopal shares his experience of witnessing the death of his uncle as a child in India. Quote, "Nobody knew what ailed him. He just collapsed and died. My grandmother woke in the middle of the night and carried me 5 kilometers to my dead uncle's home. When I woke in the morning, the extended family from far and near had assembled. No one was excluded. The elders in the society oversaw death, empowered by having seen many deaths, unquote. So as you can see, just as death can be a community event that is inclusive, and as I share further, it can also be a discriminatory experience depending on who you are. Mfo Tutu van Verth highlights this from South Africa. Quote, white, Western, relatively wealthy is a norm which every other experience must refer. Most people in the world do not have to wrestle with an over-medicalized death. They have minimal access to quality health care. Black people had no illusion that we could avoid death. And she's referring to in South Africa. The value of death, she says, is culture and race bound. In order to ascribe the correct value to death, we must assign the right price to every life. The quotes I just shared reflect some aspects of death systems. The death system is a framework and mechanism by which the Commission recommends revolutionary action in societies worldwide. Building on the definition by Robert Kestenbaum, the death system is a combined network of interactions and arrangements in any society that influence an individual's experience of dying and death. It is also the culmination of death experiences and outcomes, each of which vary by culture and community, depending on the meaning assigned to death. Moreover, death systems provide a means to understand, regulate, and manage death. They also determine where and how people die and mourn. Death systems provide, have components such as places and symbols. They also have functions such as to care for the dying, or warning and predicting death. And death systems, like the health system, the social care system, other systems that they interface with, exhibit dynamic complexity in that, one, they can be influenced by external shocks, such as, for example, changes in planetary health. Two, they showcase emerging death patterns and properties of the death as a system evolves and self-organizing. They are not linear and unpredictable, adapting the death experience to changes in cultures and conversations about death, which I hope we're about to change through this report. The rationale for the death system framework is to avoid reductionist, linear, and static approaches that do not account for complex, adaptable death systems. For death systems encompass the interrelated social, cultural, economic, religious, political, and other factors that determine death, dying, and grieving. Analyzing through a complexity lens can avoid a fragmented view of death and help address missed inefficiencies and inequities. In this diagram, you'll see one example of one part of a death system. This is by no means a representative model. The figure identifies, and you'll see in this complex way, many actions, processes, experiences, outcomes, and related associations of the death experience. The main point is that the reality of death is complex. In the figure, the patient experiences map. The map is centered around two key events in the death trajectory. First, impending death, based on an individual's knowledge or sense of death, and death itself. Balancing and reinforcing loops identify specific patterns. For example, public awareness of death, community engagement in death, and development of compassionate communities could have an additive effect to revalue death. Another example, death acceptance and a desire to bring life closure can lead to preparatory tasks, such as making of advanced decisions, which can in turn serve as the basis of a living will to reinforce preparation for death. These require integrated healthcare, legal, and societal approaches. To rebalance the death system, we need to account for a multitude of factors, such as the social, cultural, religious, ecological, behavioral, and other factors that impact death, dying, and grieving. The Commission recognizes that any effort to transform death systems needs to explicitly address inherent and inherited social and structural determinants. Marginalization of the dying and the grieving occurs through differentials in the distribution of power and resources within death systems, the unequal social, economic, and environmental conditions in which people live and die, and the presence of discriminatory practices and policies across the death trajectory. For many, the meaning of death and the experience of dying is marked by repeated subjugation of multiple layers of discrimination and disadvantage. Such marginalization occurs at the intersection and coexistence of multiple identities that shape our existence, such as race, gender, sexuality, or class. The central question then is, how do we move towards better health systems? The Commission outlines leverage points to transform our current death systems. 1, mindsets need to be altered with social and civic responsibilities that raise awareness about death and its value. Goals need to be changed, such as a primary goal of the health system to extend life. The health system should focus on extending life alongside seeking to improve the quality of end-of-life care. Moreover, the power to self-organize and mobilize, which is inherent in complex death systems, can be harnessed to rebalance the death experience and practice. Rules, such as laws related to assisted dying, can support, recognize, and facilitate death. And lastly, but not least, information. Who holds it and how it flows needs to be changed, and we need to ensure ownership of information by patients and citizens. We hope that you'll join the movement. But if you remember only one thing, we are all going to die someday. I now turn to Dr. Libby Salino to share more on the Commission's new vision and recommendations.
Thank you, Afsan. So alongside explaining and exploring how difficult experiences and times at the end of life and with death and dying can be, we also wanted to take a more optimistic and hopeful perspective. Death systems may govern, determine our experiences at these times, but they also change. They're constantly in flux. And the example of the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates just how changeable these systems can be very suddenly. So we wanted to think more intentionally about what death systems we would wish to be part of, what components they would have, and what experiences they would lead to. So we used the concept developed by the philosopher John Rawls of a realistic utopia. And this is a radically different vision of how a future could be, but along with being radical, it's practical and achievable. And it pushes for profound rather than incremental change. So we took this concept and imagined what it would look like to imagine the 5 principles on which a realistic utopia for death, dying, and grieving could be based. I'm going to talk through these 5 principles now. So the first is that the social determinants of death, dying, and grieving are tackled. And by this, we mean to extend the knowledge and the building evidence base on the social determinants of health and well-being, to understand that actually how we live determines how we die, which determines how we grieve, which also determines how we live. And so this cyclical interaction between these different components needs to be understood. Death and dying are often seen as something separate to health and well-being and to life. And poor deaths often follow poor lives, and the inequitable access to healthcare to avoid preventable deaths, but also to access pain relief when those deaths are not avoidable, is a travesty of global health and one of the most stark examples of health inequity today. So we wanted to bring this concept of the social determinants of death, dying, and grieving. The next principle is that dying is understood to be a relational and spiritual process rather than just a physiological event or a biomedical event. They're social processes. They have important medical aspects, but above all, they are social processes. And as a result, relationships are fundamental and key at these times. And often with the move to increasingly professionalized or medicalized views of death and dying, these relationships are being moved over for a more transactional nature. People having certain care, things being ticked off, and the fundamental need to connect, reflect, understand at these times is being lost. The third principle we wanted to encapsulate was the idea of the necessity of multiple inputs, contributions at these times. Doctors and nurses cannot create good deaths a family member alone can't necessarily create that. It's a multiple set of different inputs, each providing something for the person who's dying or grieving. And although we may see the importance of this diversity of inputs, and for many people they do exist, what we'd see is that they are not communicating. So often the medical or healthcare professionals will be working in a siloed way, in separate way to the family members or who maybe, and those who may be caring for them, for example, social carers or other in the community. And there's no communication. People are not working together and in partnership. So we push for more clear lines of communication, people to understand who else is involved in this network surrounding this person and how can conversations be established. There's been much discussed around the taboo of death and dying, the difficulty people have in discussing these issues and talking about them. And what we have seen, certainly, and we find evidence of this in the Commission, is that death and dying are becoming increasingly unfamiliar. Many people may not care for someone at the end of life or see someone dying until much later in their lives, which obviously is something that is something we should be proud of, and has really one of the impacts of longer life expectancy. But the side effect of this is that people don't understand the changes that happen as someone is dying, how to respond to them, what things we should be doing to care for someone at these times. And this unfamiliarity leads to further fear and a further sense that these are professional issues that need to be managed within institutions or by doctors and nurses. So in the realistic utopia, these conversations would be spoken about freely, honestly and openly, and particularly stories of everyday dying, so not kind of sensationalized front page news, but stories of people dying peacefully with their families in living rooms or care homes or hospitals around the world. And this also goes to for policy, strategy and other guidelines documents that are out that often don't include a sense of how to manage death and dying. And we'll come on to more of that in the recommendations. The final principle was probably the hardest for us to articulate, and we spent a great deal of time trying to understand this central concept and how we could articulate the sense of death having value. And we looked at philosophical, religious, spiritual writings alongside contemporary work. And whilst death is not always welcome, it has escapable value and purpose. There is a sense it bookends our lives and is a core part of our human condition. And as Richard mentioned, caring for the dying in some ways is a gift. It allows us to connect with the commonality and our shared fragility. And we tried to articulate this throughout the report. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about some of the recommendations. Obviously, it's hard to be prescriptive with something so broad-ranging as death, dying, and grieving, and the differences that different local contexts, countries will be understanding this. But we wanted to make some effort to pull out some of the core recommendations that we wanted everyone to understand. And we then break it down into different groups in society. So I'll just spend some time pulling out some of the key recommendations. We wanted relationships and this sense of the relational nature of death, dying, and grieving to be put centre stage, and that the promotion of and understanding of the role of relationships should be at the centre of efforts to improve care at these times. And that goes for within families, networks and communities, but also between healthcare professionals, patients and families they're caring, and within healthcare teams. A partnership approach is important, and we're not proposing that either healthcare services withdraw, families take this on, and communities take this on in their entirety. This is a partnership approach. We need the best parts of both, and at the moment, there's no communication between these two crucial aspects of care. And we talk about the concept of death literacy, which is similar to health literacy in that it is allowing us to understand what it means to live, die, and grieve well, what the core skills, knowledge, confidence that we need to care for people around us and make decisions for ourselves, And it's a really core skill that all of us in society should possess. We then move on to civil society, where we found many examples of community action in death, dying and grieving, and there will be examples of this all around the world. We picked some of them up in the report. And these are really countering this sense of the over-medicalisation of death and dying. They're providing a counter to this, an energy and a taking back of the relational care that is needed at this time. And we should see these develop, grow and take place across all communities. Stories and experiences of death and dying should be shared freely and made available so that people can understand what is likely to happen. People I care for, when I see people at home, often feel that they're not aware of what the next steps are, what's going to happen, and they don't have that knowledge. And so people often don't share these experiences. Often they're quite private. It's not until you begin talking to people that they talk about caring for their parents or other members of their family. We should find ways to share these experiences so that they can be accessed by those facing similar challenges and they can learn from them. And the importance of rituals, traditions and supports is so essential. And in many secular countries and societies, we're at risk of losing many of these supports that kind of provide a grounding and a sense of ongoing long-term support for these issues. And we should understand where they are. We should look to preserve them or create new ones when existing ones have disappeared. Health and social care systems are an enormous part of death systems, and we really call for all health and social care professionals to be competent in caring for the dying and the bereaved. This should not be something that is given to palliative care specialists. They have a role, but they cannot care for every dying or bereaved person within systems. That is something that should be a core skill for all health and social care professionals, and we call for this urgently. And healthcare systems, as Afsan has explained, the incredible achievements in many ways with life expectancy, the curative nature of many conditions now, but the extension of life cannot be the sole goal at all costs and at all times for healthcare services. There will be a time when people are dying and that extension of life is not possible. And at that point, we ask that healthcare systems are able to prioritise the management of suffering. We really look forward to and hope that funders will take this as an opportunity to invest in programmes, put research calls out for experimenting with this bold agenda to rebalance death and dying. And we hope this will be seen beyond healthcare interventions. This should be outside of palliative care and of health systems. This should be involving the partnerships, the discussions, the stories that we've discussed here. And we look forward to seeing these calls come out. And overtreatment was something we discussed a great deal and looked at a lot of the evidence for this. And we call on researchers to help define, understand this. There are figures suggesting spending in the last months of life and weeks of life, but it's very difficult to understand what is meant by overtreatment. This is something that is gaining more attention, more generally looking at overtreatment across a range of conditions. We would ask people to focus on what it means when dying. And for governments and policymakers, we have heard and found evidence of the catastrophic out-of-pocket expenditure that can take part, which really compounds the loss of that family member and also the overtreatment that they may have had, and it may have been futile or inappropriate. To then find families bankrupted as a result is unacceptable. And we call on governments and other policymakers to support and find ways to manage this. We found a huge difference in the guidelines that different countries have for withholding and withdrawing treatments, particularly in intensive care units. And this can cause a great deal of confusion with people feeling that it's in some way euthanasia. And we would call on countries to have clear guidelines to support clinicians, to have these conversations openly with families and to understand where it sits legally and ethically. And finally, We call for an ending of the silence, really, on death and dying. We found many reports on aging, on health, liver disease, many different conditions that just don't mention death and dying, they omit it entirely. And we call for all policies, plans and strategies about health, aging, other conditions to recognise that death and dying are normal parts of the strategy. Death and dying are a part of health and well-being, not a failure of health and well-being, and they should be recognised as such. I'm now going to pass over to Dr. Sam Guglani, consultant oncologist at Gloucestershire NHS Foundation Trust, to chair the next part of this session, where we will get to hear from our panel speakers and answer questions from the audience. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Libby. So my name's Sam. I'm an oncologist and a writer in the UK. And for the next hour and 20 minutes or so, four speakers and I will be in discussion about this important commission. They'll begin with a few minutes each, maybe followed by a reply from me if there's time, reflecting on the commission's landscape and recommendations from their own disciplinary, cultural, personal and geographic perspectives. And then we'll launch into a conversation for around 40 minutes, during which time we'll take some questions from the audience towards the end. I'll briefly introduce them now in turn. So we have Joanne Roberts, Marlene LaRue, Rajan Mani and Kevin Toulis. Joanne Roberts is, once was a newspaper reporter, is now a US palliative care physician. She's Senior Vice President and Chief Value Officer for Providence Healthcare in the US. And she was diagnosed with high-risk myelodysplastic syndrome in September of last year. Marlene LaRue is Chief Executive at Artscape, Cape Town's biggest theatre, and she works to close the social divides that have endured following apartheid. She brings people to the theatre and takes theatre out to them in the communities and rural areas. Rajan Mani is an intensive care physician in critical care in Ghaziabad, UP, India. He's the chief editor of the Indian Journal of Critical Care Medicine and the lead author for the End-of-Life Guidelines for Indian Society Critical Care of Medicine. Finally, Kevin Toulis, the BAFTA award-winning writer. He's Emmy-nominated director and screenwriter with over 20 film credits to his name. He's a bardic poet and author of the acclaimed, amongst other things, memoir of My Father's Wake, How the Irish Teach Us to Live, Love and Die. So, to each of those in turn, beginning, if I may, with Joanne. Welcome, Joanne.
Thanks, Sam. Really appreciate it. I think our task is to, on this first pass, to just give some highlights of how the report struck us. And I will say, for me, the realistic utopia is where the meat of this report really touched my heart, both as a physician and as a patient. And the parts of the utopia that struck me most were, number one, the title of the report itself. I think it is long overdue for the health system and for our cultures to value death. I mean, and I will say, even as a patient, there are many gifts in having a terminal diagnosis, none more than learning how to live in the present, something that we all aspire to do. The other piece of the utopia vision that struck me was the relational and even communal aspects of dying and death. That I liken this to the whole birthing movement years ago, where we demedicalized birthing, and I heard one philosopher say that dying is to death as birthing is to life, and I think if we took that attitude a bit more as cultures, we can embrace death in ways that actually can celebrate that value of death. And there are things like websites and StoryCorps. There are many ways for us to be communal in a modern society, but yet appreciate the communalness of the journey.
Thanks, Jan. I just wondered if you could say a bit more before we move on to Marlene, whether or not that focus within the Commission on valuing death actively is unusual in all the other literature you've looked at within your role.
As a palliative care physician, absolutely. I think in my years of practice as a palliative care physician, I felt that I was trying to patch a broken system. This report turns that upside down and says, yes, the system is broken, but not in the ways that I thought when I was practicing. The system is broken by our denial of that value of death, not denial of death, denial of the value of death. It's a gift. It is a gift, and I really appreciate the authors calling that out. It makes room for progress. It makes room for the next generation. It teaches the next generation how to care. All of the things that Libby and Afsan talked about.
And do you feel articulating that from the, I guess, relatively privileged position of a healthcare professional is at risk of sounding trite, to those who are suffering or dying? Or do you think it's something that, as a concept, is important to gain traction around and has validity?
I do. I do, and I grant you that I'm from a wealthy country, and as you say, I'm in a privileged position. But let me just give you a little insight into my background growing up. I grew up in the South of the United States, and death was something we talked about every day. Our biggest events, our biggest social events were funerals. It's when the extended families got together. My parents, they would pull out their World War II ammunition box that held all their papers every time we got together. And they say, we're going to talk about all of the legal things about our death, and we're going to talk about our funeral. And Sunday afternoons were usually spent at a cemetery. So death was just part of our life every day. And I think we've lost that, at least in the United States, that the everyday nature. We didn't talk so much about advanced directives. We just talked about death.
And I'm sure you'll come to this in our wider conversation, but would you feel comfortable at all just pointing to what this juxtaposition, I suppose, between your life as someone who has now got a serious condition and the time leading up to it as a doctor, palliative care doctor entirely, has that offered insights on that point for you?
Yeah. I think a couple of things. When I worked as a palliative care physician, I would often encounter people in the last weeks, sometimes months of life, often days, and understanding. I got my diagnosis in September of last year, and the process between the diagnosis and the end of life, the dying process. I am in the dying process. And I have work to do that is not about doctors. My work is reviewing my life, healing relationships that may need to be healed, and learning truly to live in the present, something we all say we're going to do someday. But for someone who has a terminal disease, there is no someday. Today is today. So really understanding that the work of dying is not medical work at all.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That's great. And of course, we'll come back in the group chat shortly. On now to Marlene Leroux. Marlene, the screen and microphone are yours for a couple of minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Can you? Yeah. Thanks, Marlene.
Can I start, sir?
You can go for it. Yeah, we're all ears.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'm very privileged that this commission has been started with their work. one thing that really have struck me, and I just want to frame one thing, is that I'm sitting here as a woman with a disability. I'm 54 years old from a rural community. And when we talk about intersectionality, it's about three things. It's about women being poor and being totally disadvantaged. But during death, disabilities don't count and life doesn't count. I also had the privilege of caring for a young child, Adam, who was my child, who contracted was cerebral palsy, that couldn't speak, couldn't see, and I had two carers. So life and death was intertwined. I also come from a very diverse South Africa, where death is about rituals. Death is about what this commission is actually, it's about value. It's about when my granny was a domestic worker, because I always say I'm a survivor of polio. I'm in post-polio, but I'm also a survivor of a very criminal and injustice past, which was apartheid. And being a woman of color, I've experienced, I always say I'm a survivor of apartheid, and having a disability was even worse because your life doesn't matter. So what this commission is for me of utmost important is the community as per se. And also that every life matters and every death also matters. And during COVID, one of the main things that struck me, and I became even more an activist for persons with disabilities, is that persons' lives during COVID with disabilities didn't matter. Their death didn't matter. And most of the time, not even stats was given how many persons with disability. And when hospitals needed to decide who must live and who must die, was usually not the persons with disability. So the discrimination between disability and non-persons with disabilities is still very huge, and even in death. I would like also to say I would like to put my few cents to this particular commission, is that when my son, because for me it was very important that my son was in my house, that he was never been institutionalized, but it was economics. I had a job that could allowed me that my son could have all the care, all the love. So when my child passed on, it brought even governments, opposition parties came together, family members from all over. Adam, who couldn't speak, had over 2,000 people at his funeral. So this commission resonates with me when it says that the purpose of life sometimes is even more echoed when that purpose of life is into purpose of death. So for me, I celebrate his life every single day. We also believe in ancestors. We believe in what was the value, the light of Adam's life. The light. I also had the privilege during COVID to usher my mother, because I've learned through my child's life how to usher even my mother on Christmas Day into the death cycle, where she passed through in my home once again. And the celebration of life and the purpose of life was I used that particular part in the community, because she was an ordinary farm worker who experienced the wrath of apartheid, where I could say thank you through her funeral, through her death, the purpose of her life. Once again, thousands of people lined the specific, her streets, her community, in paying tribute to perhaps would have not happened if it was in a different community. So for me, about this particular commission, it's community, it's about the rituals, it's about the interconnection about every life do matters, and it's about how governments needs to play a relationship, also about economics, also about how do we need in order that every person has the right to the value of death, and how do we talk about it, and how do we bring it together. Just in a lighter way, we talk in South Africa after tears. The main thing that usually our president needs to go on TV during COVID is to stop us not to have after tears, because we celebrate the person's life after a funeral. So in the COVID period, it was people then developed drive-throughs. And this is why I wanted to share this also on this platform, is that other ways was developed during this particular COVID in the community where I come from, where we celebrate also death, where we celebrate the person's life. We had then drive-throughs so that we adhere to COVID rules, but also celebrate the person's life.
Marlene, thank you so much. I'm sorry to, so we'll come back to a lot of these points, of course. Just briefly, though, before I come on to Raj, I think you're saying, and it's important for you to say, that unless we're able to value all life, different lives in similar fashions, then of course we won't value their deaths or revere their deaths or attend to their deaths well, which feels like a very important point to make. And perhaps we might come back to how ritual and theatre have a role there. On now, of course, to Raj. Mani, Raj, over to you.
Sam, I thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about a subject which I've come to believe is very profoundly important. And I really congratulate the Commission for touching upon all the intersections of death and life, and so elegantly exploring its impact and intersections. Now, I come with the perspective of an intensivist, so my encounter with death is almost every day, because quite a proportion of patients who we intend to treat with a curative intent do die. And it's a challenge every day to see where the transition exists to recognize death. And all these aspects were discussed well in the Commission. But most importantly, looking at death, and in India, in the ICUs, you saw that patients were dying badly, people were dying badly. And most people who could afford, and most people who couldn't afford either, were trying to get into an ICU at the end of their lives in the mistaken belief that that's where, their loved ones can be cared for properly. It's on the contrary. That's where we amplify the suffering. It's a double whammy. There's a suffering by the disease, then there's suffering foisted upon them by advances in medicine. And unwisely overtreating and not having an option, not having an alternative thinking. So this paper is provocative, and I hope it stirs the conscience, because having witnessed this tragedy day after day, along with my colleagues, we embarked on this, finding ways to improve upon it, bring about a reform in the way we practice intensive care or way we deal with death. So that transformed us from technical people who were manipulating physiology, to carers. Because ultimately the mission of medicine and intensive care is to care. So the caring aspect had atrophied, had sort of not developed. And we came to believe that putting a line in or putting a tube in was more important, and to touch the human being and to see how we can care truly. That is, of course, integrate palliative care principles, but very importantly, unburden the non-beneficial treatment. So to my horror, I found that there was nothing in law or policy, national policy, which touched upon death. Even the latest national policy, which integrates palliative care right from the community, doesn't mention the needs of the dying. And that was a big challenge. So since 2005, we made a position statement, an ethical position statement. And there's always the question that this could be mistaken for euthanasia or suicide or abetting suicide. And people queried the legality. So we got lost in the question of legality and self-protection from liabilities, rather than talking about death itself. You know, the core thing is about the value of death. And the title is very impressive. How can we do anything valuable if we don't look after the dying, you know, in the proper way? And the grieving, of course. The grieving can't be left out. You also brought out the inequities in the societies of the world which accentuate this problem. The paradox.
You take the fingers of your...
I will end here and take questions, you know, Sam, because this way the dilemma, and we had to manage our own biases against talking about death, exploring death, our own fears of confronting death. So it is actually a self-development. It's an opening up ourselves to the human condition itself. So we can't stop at being a technical level as a doctor. We have to move over and develop as a carer in the true sense. This is what I would like to say.
Thank you very much, Raj. We'll come back to many of those points, of course, in our discussion very shortly. Our final speaker presentation for this part of the session is Kevin Toulis. Kevin, over to you for a few minutes before we launch into debate.
So I'd like to start really with an old story. The gods send a message to an old king, and they say, "We will disguise you so you can enter the enemy camp, find your son's killer, and then try and ransom your dead son's body off him." When the king tells his queen about the god's message, she is horrified. She says, "Don't go. Man slaying Achilles will kill you too." And then the old man, King Priam of Troy, says something strange and wonderful and difficult certainly for many people in the West to understand. He says, "I don't care if the Greeks kill me, just as long as I have the heart-comforting embrace of my dead son in my arms." My dead son in my arms. Doesn't the old man know that the bodies of the dead are worthless? Who would risk their life for a corpse? The story comes from Book 24 of the Iliad, written by Homer in 750 BC, about the fall of Troy, the siege of Troy. It was, you never read the Iliad. It was performed and recited for thousands of years. You heard the words of wisdom of our ancestors, of their wisdom, of a more holistic vision of life and death. Just as in a sense the report points to those goals that death is common, can be talked about, that death has value. And I take away from reading the report really is this incredible attempt to rebalance our relationship between life and death, to reintegrate them as our ancestors did in all of their societies. And it's not necessarily an abstract thing. It is something that we all need to do in our own personal lives. I'm not a medical professional, many people here are, but here's actually a test that you can do right now, sitting in front of your computer, wherever you are in your world. If you take the fingers of your right hand right now and try and count off the number of corpses that you have seen, touched, kissed, and embraced, will that count reach the fingers of your left hand? Because truly, in a way, the way that we will rebalance life and death is to bring back the commonality of death into our lives. So that I come from a tradition of the Irish wake, where people still do go to wakes, they go to funeral homes. An ordinary middle-class person would see dozens, if not hundreds, of dead bodies in the course of very ordinary life. And that is sort of important, because that brings us back, even if actually if you think about it, it brings us back that encounter between the living us and the dead them remains the very epicenter of all human civilization, spawning our eternal quest for eternal life. Every religion, holy book, temple, prophet, and it's actually fueled countless of other wars and the deaths of millions of other human beings of a deathless heaven. But the past human experience, obviously, was where death and the bodies of the dead, the commonality of that experience, was intrinsic and central to human experience. And what obviously I see in the report, the way that it talks about the death system, certainly the Western death system has sought to remove the dead, both physically, the very presence and sight of them, but obviously as we've done that, we've then removed the mechanism by which we can talk about death in our ordinary societies, and people's experience, obviously, of dying and the dead, and what to do, how to comfort the bereaved, how to manifest grief. All of these things really revolve around this absencing of the bodies of the dead before us. So obviously, it's very common, actually, I think, in England and parts of the West, that you can live your whole life and never, ever physically see a human corpse. And I think clearly in the report is trying to address that in many complex ways, but that remains that very simple step. How many corpses have you seen, touched, kissed, and embraced in your own personal life?
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. So I think we have the whole panel now for around half an hour, just under, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. We've notionally got an hour in total, but I think we could probably lock the doors and keep going for a few days. I just wondered if I might start by, you've all said this in different ways, dying and death happens to us, within us, inside and to our bodies. And broadly, there's a recognition that something is awry in medicine and society, other way around, society and medicine, how we encounter death. And it strikes me that when we talk about the relationship being unhealthy, an important term that comes out in the Commission is a lack of, or faulted balance, an absence of balance. And I wondered if between you all you could say something now about where that balance has gone awry, particularly around the whole business of encountering life and therefore death as a physiological event, as opposed to one loaded with meaning and spirituality. And if, as you likely will do, can say where that's gone awry, how you think we might, in this modern world, address that, readdress that balance. I might start, if I may, Marlene, with you on that.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm so happy you touching on this. Is to demedicalize death is for me of utmost importance. And it was for me very liberating going through the report that that's one of the aspects. Is I had the privilege of having my son being in my lap, and even for 5 to 6 hours after he has passed from this life through, I could have him with me and family members and friends and community be part of that. And it was humbling, and it was for me, and I think also for him, it was that particular connection between life and death. And I again got and I'm so happy Kevin is talking about the wakes. And Kevin, I want to say, I can't even tell how many corpses I have, and I don't want to mention the name as a corpse. I think even we need to re-look and on naming as well, because it is the physical body that we're talking about. The same was with the ushering of my mother. It's about the demedicalised. I've asked them to bring her home. And it's that piece, and it helps when the Commission speaks about the grieving aspect. It is also about the ushering between the grieving person and the person that is passing through this particular life. And that is for me importance of this particular Commission. How do we verbalize this? How do we tell these stories in order for us to demedicalize this? We've seen it in COVID, where it is about everything happens in the ICU. I needed to say that very clearly, that my son is not going to go to hospital for palliative care. I am his palliative care with the community and family. It was all the time a fight between, and I want to say a fight between the medical practitioner and between me as his primary caregiver, as his mother. The same with my mother, who had COVID, who was placed into my care. That is my part on that particular question. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Marlene. Raj, if I may come to you, and you were talking there about how much easier it is to put in another line or do another test. Often those things are important things. Often those things are important things.
Yeah.
Raj, how does the one balance that need to do those things against meeting a body as an entity with meaning rather than just simply a structure to act upon?
You see, talking to families, the way you care for the patient who is dying is, of course, palliative care. But there is another aspect. There is talking to families. That's the way you care for families. Now, there are two things very important. One is to emotionally support the family. And number two, to get decisions of withdrawal, withholding, for instance. Now, what I have seen is these decisions come easy and the support is effective if we talk about the meaning in this situation, meaning in the dying and death, rather than just talk about the physiology, talk about this level and that level, and talk about the disease. So when we talk about the person, we get to know the values, we get to know what would give meaning to the person's passing away and to the family. So reading meaning is important, and that's not possible if we have a purely focus on the body. The spirit is important, the faith is important. So we realize that the humanity side of medicine needs to be developed. I think it has taken a short shift after the advances in technology. So we got to return to some part of what existed before 1950s. And during that transition came Dame Cicely Saunders and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So we have to go to the mindset which addressed humans as multidimensional rather than just the physiology and aberrations thereof.
Thank you very much. Kevin, with that in mind, do you think you're almost pointing to an idea whereby I often find myself wondering why doctors are so bad at this, or healthcare professionals are so bad at this, but you're almost articulating that actually as a society we've become so separated from the visceral fact of death. It's perhaps no surprise in that surfaces in a healthcare environment and amplifies
Well, I remember talking to a few doctors who say that, after medical training, that's about it. And that, so it is interesting the way that the body has been removed from the centrality, certainly within the Western death system. You point to the death system in the report. I've talked before about the Western death machine, but really what the Western death machine does through, hospitalization, medicalisation, through professional undertakers, is abstract the body, really colonize these of dealing with death. Like Marlene was talking about her dead son in her arms, that this was, people even talk about a home funeral. I mean, all funerals used to be home funerals. But obviously what's happened with these interlocking institutions is that, certainly I think in the Western world, people feel totally powerless about controlling the bodies of their dead. They don't really have a well-founded ritual and mechanism. They're entirely at the mercy of these much more powerful institutional forces, whether it's obviously in the hospital in terms of treatment or withdrawing treatment, but also what to do afterwards. What rituals, how do you come together? In England, it's impossible to get buried within 6 weeks, unless you're a particular minority faith. But generally, it's impossible because all crematoriums are booked out, and you can't get any burial space. And that people would just say, well, that's the way of modern death. But obviously that has a terrible, I think, traumatic effect on families. You don't have this constrained, cathartic event like an Irish wake. The community can't gather around you. Now, it's a simple contrast. In Dublin, which is a very old city, it's 1,000 years old, has a population of 1.2 million. It's not a small little, village. You can still get buried within 3 days because the death system, the mechanism, allows that. So there is provision for literally the burial of the dead. And that does actually enable a rite like the Irish wake. People hear about someone dying, they come together, they have either a wake at the house, or maybe they go to a funeral home, but the family can gather around community in this short burst. And then in that wonderful phrase by Marlene, this person into death, and this rite of burial. So it is these mechanisms which break up this ancient pattern of human dying, of communal grief, of the rite of burial. And how that's happened is subject to a lot of investigation, but it is something that's, I think, unnatural, that leads to more grief and trauma and more pain and dislocation about what do we do about death. And again, going back to the commission in the sense of that goal of the realistic utopia, goal 4, that death, is common, that we can talk about this, that it's part of our lives.
Thank you. And just before I come on to Joanne, we lament the loss of these rituals and a commonality, I guess, of language and experience. But here we are in the modern world, and what new rituals, or how do we reinvigorate those rituals and rites that seem to, be working where you're living, but certainly not in other parts of the high and middle income world?
So, Sam, is that a question? Go ahead. No.
I was just thinking briefly to come in before I come to you, Joanne, if that's all right. Kevin, have you got a view on that?
Sorry, you're talking to me.
I was done, but it's fine. I'll move on to Joanne. Thanks. Okay. Thanks, Joanne. Do come in.
I would really love to hear from Kevin, and I think Marlene was going to chime in.
Can I ask you to come in first, and we'll come back?
Sure, but I won't address that question. I'm going to go back to the question of the valuing, and my comments really follow a little bit more on Raj's, because I came from the healthcare sector, and so I that is my mindset. And You know, my experience as a palliative care physician in the ICU or in the hospital, with lots of resistance to death by families, by the culture, even by the staff. And you know, I found one question would open a door. I found was, tell me about growing up with your mother. Tell me about the memories of your childhood with your mother. And as people would talk about that, you could see them start to stop resisting death as they spoke about the life of the person dying. You could see them literally start to embrace their death. It was a wonderful question, and it is one that perhaps if I gave a doctor any advice, that would be ask questions like that. And my doctor, you know, Sam, in the palliative care community, oncologists get a bad reputation, I think, sometimes.
Oh, everywhere. Yeah.
And my oncologist said something to me that just opened my eyes. He said, "I'll walk this journey with you." What an amazing statement to hear from a physician.
Thanks, Joanne. I'd like to come back to you and Raj on this question, on this whole point of how we have the so-called difficult conversation shortly within and outside of medicine. But Marlene and Kevin, Marlene, you were going to come back with a point about rituals, and I think Kevin may have had some more to say on that. So either of you first.
Kevin?
Yeah, hi. You go first, Marlene.
I just, before I lose my thought, Joanne, it's really to look at the curriculum also of medical, as per se, because what I've experienced is that it's so medical orientated, and what you just said, walking this path, a physician saying that, it's the biggest thing that I'm activising with is universities needs to relook at the curriculum as well. But on the question that's been asked is that we must learn from each other's cultures. And I think coming from a very diverse culture, even in death, I've learned so much from my Muslim family members as well, which I incorporated in my own life with the sanaza, where washing of the body, cleansing the body, as per se, it's a holy process and it's an immediate effect. So going to Bali, for instance, to having the walk in that particular procession. So I think it is also about become so much more knowledgeable. In the Western world, it's about, do we have enough knowledge about each other? We're so fearful of the other. We're talking about the other, that we don't even think about what can we learn from each other's rituals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly. And Kevin, on that?
So here's a little ritual on the island of my ancestors, which is off the west coast of Ireland. There are no professional pallbearers. So the dead are always carried by members of their own community. And it used to be, it's like an Irish tribal wish, that you will be carried to the grave by the men of your own line. Now, that would be 6 sons, which was like a wish where you were fertile. They loved you at the end. They didn't throw you in a hole. And they gave you this right of burial. Obviously, not every family has 6 sons now, but people gather together. It's always a communal rite. It's an honor to carry the dead, and you carry them from the hearse into the church, and then you also carry them from the hearse onto the mountainside where they're buried. And there's an old Irish word for this. It's called a meitheal, which is a way of exchanging labor, not money. But it is, in this death ritual, it's like a transcendental meitheal, that as you carry this coffin of your dead sister or dead brother, like a kind of communal, not your physical brother and sister, so too will you be carried in time to come by somebody else in that community. That there is this, it does take a village to bury someone. and that these are little rites and rituals which the Western death machine has stopped, usually for commercial reasons. Something that you can even do in your own life amongst your own dead is that when the undertaker says, well, we have to do it this way, we have our professional pallbearers, they will, well, why not go back to that old way? Why not just insist? Usually, even if it's just the golf club, you know, you can probably get enough guys in the golf club together to carry the coffin back and forth. And all of those things are really a marker of this ancient ancestral binding between the living and the dying and the dead. And that, I think, is the centrality of what's gone wrong with death, and which I think the Commission report really does try to redress, is that we've deracinated, ruined and sort of hollowed out these old rituals which connected a community to its own dying members, and that saw that as a responsibility and also an honour and an obligation.
Thank you, Kevin. That phrase, well, it takes a village to bury the dead, I want us to come on very presently to our connection and disconnection from one another and from those who have died, and the impact of that, I guess, and how communities, and certainly compassionate communities, as alluded to in the Commission, may go some way to healing that. But before I do, and before we get to questions, Joanne and Raj, without wanting to foreground medicine here, and the Commission works hard not to do that, this whole question of what has been phrased for so long as the difficult question, rather than the important or the necessary question, and the difficult conversation rather than the insignificant or important conversation. How does that play out in healthcare environments where, like it or not, we find so much of death and dying taking place? Why are we so bad at doing that? Joanne, you gave a really beautiful example there of how language may be deployed better. But Raj, how do you see that playing out on ITU?
Sam, I think very beautifully the Commission report says it's an inept, so-called difficult conversation. Certainly, essential conversation is what I have always told myself, because we don't want a barrier between yourself and the patient or the family. So the transactional relationship is always suspect, and it just generates conflict. So if it is, it has to be relational, obviously. There has to be a fiduciary relationship, obviously, between the physician and the patient and extending to the family. If that is central to our practice, then we would certainly be honest and open the question of prognosis early rather than late, and then open the options early rather than late, and make the transition to comfort care, palliative care early, and be supportive through the process, and right up to the grieving, right? So the responsibility, the relationship, the fiduciary responsibility continues through the process of decision-making, of withdrawal and withholding, or DNAR or whatever, or not going to the hospital at all, not entering the ICU at all. So beginning very early, and supporting all the way through, right up to grieving, is what would make a complete intensivist or a physician, in my opinion.
And Raj, what stops that? To what extent are we fearful of it?
In different cultures, different things may stop you, but I think what's common to all cultures is the unrealistic expectations from medicine and advances. And of course, the barrier to discussing death openly, the death defiance, the resistance to talking openly about death, and also a resistance to move away from the body and talk about the spirit. I think it's very common. And added to this, in my country and in the low middle income countries, very often the barrier is the national policy, which is not explored, all this. The barrier is the institutional policies, and in the physicians and caregivers themselves, that they think it is not their job, or it is not giving them any value, or if in a consumerist society, you want to exploit the consumerism rather than explore the humanism, right, of what you're doing. So this is very important because it's fee-for-service ruling the roost everywhere, even in the public sector hospitals in India, because the culture of looking at death, culture of managing death and dying has not taken root. I think withdrawal withholding is a taboo subject as of now, in spite of constitutional validity of. In practice, it's a taboo subject.
Thanks, Raj.
Unfortunate. So that's the tragedy. Yeah.
Joanne, coming to you, if I may, in your experience on both sides of that thin line that separates doctors and patients, but your experience as a palliative care physician, to what extent is misappropriated or mischosen language contributory to overtreatment, inappropriate treatment, futile treatment?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think three things come to my mind in this conversation, and it starts, and this is something I've been preaching my whole career. It starts with the kind of people we choose for medical training, often people who have no experience with death, who are emotionally fairly immature in their training, and we don't introduce them to death and dying in a very intentional way. So I think the kinds of people who become doctors are actually averse to having the conversation in the first place. I think culturally, at least in the United States, we use language that refuses to acknowledge death. We talk about cancer survivors. We talk about fighting the battle with the disease. We talk about chronic illness rather than terminal or life-limiting illness. So that kind of vocabulary is death-denying. When I practiced palliative care, I practiced in the hospital, and I had 4 questions I asked every patient or every family. And the first question was, how do you do? I'm Dr. Roberts. Tell me what's going on with you. And I will tell you about half of the patients responded, well, doctor, I'm dying, but no one's ever mentioned it to me. So it's not as if people don't know they're dying. They know they are dying, especially as their disease progresses. But they have been afraid to ask, and the doctors have been afraid to tell.
Thank you. And of course, language is what, in many ways, in whatever form it takes, bridges the gap almost between people. I'd like to come on now to this whole business of how disconnected we are from one another, certainly in high and middle income countries where autonomy and individualism is prized over community, and certainly in our sense of the world stage. And COVID has really sharpened this image for me of being utterly disconnected from our shared humanity with others on other parts of the country or other parts of the world. Marlene, the Commission makes no, it's upfront about many of its perspectives coming from high and middle income countries. But can you just say a bit about how the landscape, I guess, for more impoverished societies or individuals directly impacts, I guess, on their experience of life and therefore death, and how communities empowered go some way towards addressing that?
I think from a South African and African perspective, overall, it's a very religious continent. So faith do play a very big role, and this is diverse faith, interfaith as well. And death, the ritual of death is of utmost importance. And it is also a matter of when you're in the rural areas, as per se, it's the community that carries you to that grave. It's the community that will dig the grave. It's the wake. It is all of that. And this is where classism also plays a big role. I'm talking general now. I'm not talking about my own experience, but class has also come out very clearly, is that the bigger your coffin, the bigger your pole barriers. And that is what we at this particular stage is also in South Africa and in Africa is about how do we bring it back to our rituals where it was faith-based, but most important, it was about a community celebrating life and also commemorating the life of the dead. Most important also for us is that we still have the rituals of going to the grave, having specific days that we will remember, and their class don't play a role. Where it's really a classism when it's about and I want to make, this conversation is not just about a crying conversation. I just want to say there's also lots of laughter that can be celebrating as well. So lots of singing is happening, lots of a way of celebrating, but also it is about also the milestones of that person's life. So just recently, I also was part of a celebration where this person has passed 2 years, another 3 years. Then you have the celebration of life. Where it really comes to the fore, it's the classism, where it is about becomes so individualistic, where we tend to be starting to be very much individualistic. And that is where this commission is for me very refreshing, that we even from a perspective, from an African perspective, where death counts very much in our lives, where we now need to teach our young persons again the importance of the intertwining between life and death and the rituals thereafter.
Thank you, Marlene. Apologies for being short on time. I'm going to open up to questions in 2 minutes now. Raj, I just wanted you to make a comment, if you would, about the central paradox, which is talked about in the commission of this over-treatment that we see in so much of more privileged parts of the world, yet at the same time under-treatment of very simple measures and indeed analgesia, which can have such a huge impact on suffering. And if you could just say something about your experience of how the social determinants of health also impact, in fact, on how people die.
There is this over-treatment and under-treatment juxtaposed in where I work in the ecosystem of India. On the one hand, there's deprivation, there's lack of access. I've even worked in the interiors of Uttar Pradesh, where there is no access to modern medicine. So that's on one side. But however, suffering doesn't reduce on account of that. There is no palliative care or awareness of palliative care, even. And then, of course, the access to opioids is difficult. The over-treatment is in the context of relative non-affordability. That is another big tragedy. There is imposition not only of physical pain and burdensome treatments on the patient, there is also huge impact on the economic status of the family. And millions are pushed below the poverty line for having to sustain an intensive care treatment indefinitely in the face of impossible odds. So that is the problem. So it is not only to unburden the interventions for the patient, but also to prevent the devastation on the family, even to the next generation. So this is the problem. And then the issue of palliative care access, particularly opioids, and that is that also needs a lot of work.
Thanks very much, Raj. I'm going to open it up to, we've got a good 3,000 questions here. So I'm going to start with one here that strikes me, which is to say that the modern palliative care movement now has been in full throttle for some 80 years, yet here we are having this conversation. The question is, what has gone wrong? Joab, to you.
That was a great question. I was scratching my head trying to answer it. But In my world, palliative care remains a very medical model, and it is run by physicians. The team may have other members, but it's still primarily a medical specialty. And it seems like it has wedged itself into the continuum somewhere between our traditional specialists like oncologists and cardiologists and hospice. And I don't think that was a need that we had, but that's what it has become, at least in this country. What I'm excited about this time around are concepts like death doulas, people who are not part of the medical system at all, being a major force in this work. And I'll tell you, finding a doula was one of the first things I did as a doctor after my diagnosis, because I knew that was going to be more important than the medicine.
Thank you, Joanne. I've got a question here from Joseph Sawyer, who describes health systems which have now adopted, or perhaps even hijacked, the narrative of living well with chronic and terminal illness. In fact, we don't have to look much further than our Sunday papers to talk about how we have to live well. Do the panel feel this has contributed to concealing the value of death? And if so, how do we rebalance that from living well to dying well within our realistic utopias? Kevin, could I come to you on that as a normal human being?
Yeah, I suppose there's just one thing. A friend just texted me to say there's not been enough discussion really about the role of nurses. We obviously spend, a huge amount of time, the vast majority of time, nursing these patients into sort of death. And obviously that is a reflection of, again, this old pattern of dying where, in Troy and the Iliad, the body of Hector, was washed by the women of his own household. When my own father was dying on the island, he died at home, and we had call it Mban Kinsha, kind of chief keener, but she was an aunt, and she'd seen a lot of people die, and she basically helped usher him into death and also sort of guided us. And it's that soft institutional knowledge which obviously passes down. Hopefully that's addressed some of what you've been asking about how really we can't sort of go back to live on Irish islands, but we have to somehow recognize the value of these soft rituals, of these communal rituals, in a way of addressing the problem with the institutional, the way that institutions basically always act in the interest of the institution, and that the product in between, which is just happens to be these dying patients, that they are just product. The institution can't really help itself. That's what it will do, and it's almost like to regain control. Some of it can be just an act of will, just saying, well, look, we are going to carry the coffin, we can do that, or we do want to stop treatment here, etc. But sometimes you need to be armed with that knowledge, and I think again that's the purpose of the report, to help with the arming of knowledge that there are choices here, rather than just having to accept what is determined by those institutions.
Thank you, and thank your friend for a comment. Within the actual paper, of course, we refer to health professionals, and I just happen to be a reluctant doctor on the panel. It's interesting, the whole the lexicon that attaches itself to this of soft and hard skills, because arguably, from what we've been saying, the notionally hard skills are failing us, and the soft skills, whoever inhabits those, be it doctor, nurse, chaplain, cleaner or physio, is important, vital to what we're trying to move forward with. How do we? There's a broad question here, which I think actually is a big question for the whole of the commission, and for all of the panel. How do we overcome the inability to talk, feel, accept death? You've all been talking about this, but it's interesting because it does keep coming back to that actually almost centrally there feels to be a real human reluctance or fear around it. Anyone for that? anyone has something to say that they haven't said so far?
I would like to say something, Sam.
Of course. Molly.
Parents, especially mothers with children with disabilities, has actually thanked me because I was very open with the life of Adam and the journey through my acceptance of the journey through going through death. And I'm speaking here with a disability and experience all the time as a disability activist, where life and death of persons with disabilities are not treated equally, not even in hospitals or with caregivers or sometimes with palliative care. And here on this particular, as a presenter, I need to also to voice that particular concern where you are being rightfully say, but aren't you relieved that your child is just died, or in aid of, we will help you with the death of your child. So that is also that we need to acknowledge because of the stigma that carries with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly. Did anyone else want to come back on that?
Sam, I want to make a point. See, what happens is, when we broach the subject of death with families, we should be prepared for the grief reaction, the anticipated grief reaction, denial and anger, for instance, and we should be able to support them through it. So the difficult conversation appears difficult because we don't want to do this job. Okay. If we accept this is essential, then we will support them through these. It's not that people don't understand what death is or they cannot accept, but there is a process. And a part of our job is to support them through it. And then this gets easier and easier. And we get skilled at it as we do it. So we mustn't shy of this exercise, mustn't shy of talking about death, mentioning death actually, and not use euphemisms, use the correct word, and get people to come to terms with it. That's what I believe, that a conversation should be effective if we could accept the reactions of denial and anger to begin with, and get skilled at negotiating. Yeah.
I mean, we have a follow-on question.
Could I just make a point, Sam?
Of course, Kevin. Yeah, sorry. Go on.
So really the answer is, of course, it's not just in a medical context. And obviously if the Commission has value, is to make death common again. When my own father was dying of pancreatic cancer, quite swiftly on the island one summer, like all of us, he was afraid of dying. I think it's perfectly natural, we're all afraid of dying. But at the same time, because my father had been educated within an Irish wake tradition, as many people would have been in low-income countries, having seen people die from a very early age as a child, having seen that process all over and over again. Now, it didn't arm him completely, it didn't overcome all of his fear, but in the end, it ultimately aided him in his acceptance of the inevitability of his own death, that there was no point in sort of thrashing around, wasting useless energy. And also he was enabled to do so because his community also never shunned death. I mean, we've not really talked here a lot about, a community visiting the sick and the dying. Maybe this is in the case in Kerala, where, death is more integrated, where people came to see my father to say goodbye. And sometimes even strangers came to see him. I mean, the house, it was more like a kind of wedding feast. There was a line of suitors. Now, sometimes he saw them and sometimes he didn't when he was too tired. But again, it was this social acceptance enabled him to have a personal acceptance. And that was because, obviously, this was an ancient communal right that still persisted and was replenished. And of course, that's almost like an ideal state where death is perfectly integrated into communities. And it does obviously help with the passage out of his dying, and obviously hugely helps with the sort of family. It reverberates because, of course, when he was actually moved from the room in which he died into the sitting room, my tiny sort of nieces and nephews, who range between 6 and 7 and 9, were sort of playing at the feet of the coffin. And it was all part of their life experience. Now, that's not going to take away from the existential fear of death, but it does enable, it gives a set of life skills and a set of death skills. Yeah. And I think that's what the Commission, in a sense, is trying to push towards, is that it's not just a conversation that takes place in the ICU or in the palliative care. And if it's only taken place there, then it's too late already.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's tremendous, in fact, for what it's worth. I think we can't, and a tall claim, almost an arrogant claim, to say we can extract the fear, but it's how we as human organisms contend with that fear, and communities, rituals, the normalizing of death by its presence within our societies goes some way towards lifting us from that place of fear, and therefore, hopefully, functioning better as societies and health organisations and health systems. I'm afraid we will have to close our conversation there. We're not allowed to carry on for days, I've been told. And thanks so much to the panel. And I'd like to now hand back to Libby Salmo. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. So I'm just going to move to a few points to close our webinar now. But crucially, although the webinar is ending, this launch is the beginning, not the end of this work. And we were really keen to make this clear that this is the beginning of conversation, the beginning of action, beginning of change. And we hope that you will join us in this mission. We have the information on the Lancet homepage and the Commission landing page, similarly across Twitter, and the hashtag Value of Death and the new Twitter handle Value of Death Commission. And so please read the report, reflect, think, and understand what actions you will be taking personally, locally or regionally. We want to thank the Lancet, GW4, NIHR Bristol, Biomedical Research Centre and St Christopher's Hospice for the support in getting this report discussed and published over the past 4 years. And I just want to take a moment to thank and mention all of the commissioners and authors who could not be here on this panel. We're a large and diverse group, so I'm just going to run through their names to thank them personally for the input that they have given over the past 4 years. So along with us, Sam, Richard and I, we had Sam Armadazi, Charlotte Chamberlain, Yarli Kong, Brett Dobble, Luxon Dooley, Robin Jury, Eric Finkelstein, Melanie Hodgson, Bettina Husbo, Alan Kelleher, Cecilia Kitzinger, Jenny Kitzinger, Felicia Now, Scott Murray, Julia Neuberger, Seamus O'Mahony, M.R. Rajgopal, Sarah Russell, Eric O'Sass, Catherine Sleeman, Sheldon Solomon, Ros Taylor, Mahmoud Van Firth, and Katrina Wyatt, Jane Blaseby, Arnaldo Kraus, and Malcolm Johnson. And I mean, that is obviously a huge list, and without their tireless contribution, support, the journey that we all embarked on would have been much less rich. And I think the report is a real testament to the diversity of different people who have attempted to address these questions. So I'm going to close now to say that with our key contention and our main point is that death and dying must be recognised as not only normal but valuable. Care of the dying and grieving must be rebalanced, and we call on all throughout society to respond to this challenge. Many thanks.